A single statement. That's all it was. Terror is evil, period.
Right.
And Washington just broke, sent a shockwave through the system, and the silence that followed was deafening.
It wasn't just silence, it was panic. The most devastating fact is that the panic wasn't over the idea of condemning terror. The panic was over the clarity.
Stay with us as we expose the full truth right here on News Focus Podcast. If you want the news they don't want you to hear, hit that subscribe button right now.
For you, our listener, our mission today is to get past the headlines. We need to understand why the words moral clarity have become, well, politically radioactive.
Because this isn't just about one senator. It's about the language of power, the fear of the base, and this huge growing gap between what normal people want and what politicians are willing to say out loud.
Exactly. We're looking at a system that relies on what you could call managed complexity. And Senator Fetterman just walked in with a dose of fatal simplicity.
Okay, so let's start right there. The moment it happened. The unqualified condemnation. Fetterman's exact stance, according to our sources, was just brutal in its simplicity. Terror is evil, period. He explicitly said, no qualifiers, no footnotes, no, but on the other hand.
Right. He added none of that.
Yeah.
It was designed to be the end of the conversation, not the beginning, a final moral judgment.
And the effect in the room. Our sources say Democrats didn't argue, they didn't clap, they just froze.
They froze. That freeze tells you everything. It was a complete political vacuum. See, they couldn't argue with him. Morally, how could you?
You can't.
But they absolutely could not affirm him. They couldn't clap. They couldn't pivot to a talking point. The entire machine just seized up.
That visible freeze, it's like a system error. It shows they literally had no pre-programmed response for one of their own speaking with total moral certainty.
That's it, exactly. Machinery locks up. If he'd said, well, terrorism is a complex issue requiring nuance, they have a whole playbook for that.
Right.
They have talking points, op-eds, everything ready to go. But for terrorism is evil, period.
Yeah.
The system had nothing. It was an input it couldn't process.
Because it strips away the but. Yes, but we have to consider the root causes. He just took the but and threw it out the window.
And with it, the party's entire messaging apparatus. Which brings us to the word itself. The word that caused the panic. Evil.
This is the part I just can't wrap my head around. Why would calling a terror attack evil cause a meltdown in a major American political party, it seems like? Table stakes.
Well, because our sources are clear. This is a word that Democrats have systematically trained themselves to avoid.
Train themselves, like an allergy.
Almost. The word evil is absolute. It's non-negotiable. It has a biblical finality to it. It slams the door on this kind of academic sociological debate that the progressive wing of the party needs to have.
So what's the language they prefer?
Oh, it's a very specific dialect. They prefer terms that avoid final judgment. Things are complex, they're contextual,
Right.
or they'll immediately pivot to talking about root causes.
Right, the academic jargon.
Yes, layers and layers of it. Systemic inequities, colonial paradigms, de-escalation. The goal is to treat the act of violence not as a moral crime to be condemned, but as a sociological symptom to be analyzed.
So Fetterman's sin wasn't condemning the act, but the unambiguity of the condemnation. He didn't leave them any wiggle room.
Exactly. Complexity is control. When you call something complex, you control the narrative. You get to be the expert who explains it. You manage all the competing demands from your coalition.
But when you call it evil,
You hand the moral authority back to the public because every single person listening already knows what that word means. The political class loses its role as the mediator of truth.
and you have to put this against the backdrop of, well, the Trump administration's style. Our sources point this out. Blunt language is already out there. Ambiguity is just not in fashion with voters anymore.
That's a critical point. The national security conversation, especially from the right, is all about decisive, clear language,
Right.
naming threats, defining enemies. So when Democrats respond with these, linguistic gymnastics, it just makes them look weak,
It makes them look unsure.
deeply unsure. Voters are feeling vulnerable. They want certainty. Fetterman tapped into that public mood, and that's why it resonated so much outside of Washington. He spoke their language.
Which leads to the most shocking part of the internal reaction. To the public, he was a hero. Internally, our sources say his statement was seen as betrayal.
Yes, and this is where you really see how modern party loyalty works.
Yeah.
It wasn't about moral courage. It was seen as a profound violation of protocol.
What protocol?
The protocol of staying inside the approved language lane, of maintaining messaging discipline. Party loyalty today has less to do with shared values like, say, agreeing that terror is evil,
Yeah.
and everything to do with protecting the fragile political framework that keeps their very diverse coalition from flying apart.
Yeah. Wait, hold on. I have to push on that. Are you seriously saying that using a universally understood moral term like evil to describe a terror attack is seen as an act of sabotage inside the Democratic Party? That is that is beyond cynical.
Functionally, from a messaging discipline perspective,
Yes.
think about their coalition. It's incredibly precarious. You've got highly progressive activists who see the world through a lens of international grievance, right alongside moderate security-first voters.
The messaging is the only thing holding that together. It's the guardrail.
Exactly. And Fetterman didn't just bump the guardrail, he drove right through it.
Yeah.
The immediate, intense backlash, the quiet condemnations, the leadership going silent, it all proves the point.
So if condemning terror without qualifiers causes this much of a panic, the system is actively designed to avoid moral clarity.
The fear wasn't about what he said. The fear was about the damage he did to the strategic framework that keeps all those contradictory pieces of the party from collapsing. He exposed the game.
So loyalty isn't to an ideal, it's to the strategy of communication. And by breaking that, he basically handed a map of their biggest weakness to the opposition.
That is the core takeaway from our sources. His clarity revealed what the party is really protecting. And it isn't a moral high ground. It's the coalition's own fragile stability.
Wow. Okay, so if the word evil was the first shockwave, the thing that turned the silence into outright panic was the Ted Cruz alignment.
The detonator.
This is the part that reads like a political satire. Fetterman didn't just say terror was evil. He went on to say he sided with Ted Cruz on it.
And that is the symbolic core of the whole crisis. Ted Cruz is not just some other senator. In the Democratic psyche, he is the symbolic antithesis, the name you are never, ever supposed to align with.
He's the firewall. He's the justification for the entire partisan divide.
Absolutely. For the activist base, agreeing with Ted Cruz on anything is a form of moral contamination. It doesn't matter what the topic is, because Cruz himself is used as a symbol of absolute moral opposition.
But Fetterman didn't endorse his tax plan. He stated a moral fact that happened to align with something Cruz also said. The common ground was inherent to the issue itself.
And that single admission, as one source put it, detonated the narrative.
What narrative?
The narrative that truth is partisan. The idea that on every single issue, from healthcare to foreign policy, only one side holds the moral truth. When Fetterman admitted he had common ground with the party's ultimate villain on a question of basic morality, the whole structure just crumbled.
He exposed the artifice.
Completely. Because think of the impossible bind it put the leadership in. If they attack Cruz for his statement, they are, by extension, attacking their own senator.
And if they attack Fetterman, they look insane. They're basically saying, no, you can't agree with the other side that terror is evil.
So the silence turned to panic. Because that bipartisan firewall, the very thing that keeps the two parties locked in their corners on every issue, it just cracked under the weight of one simple, shared truth.
Which gets to this terrifying idea that our sources raise, bipartisanship as contamination. The idea that agreement actually breaks control. How is unity a bad thing?
Because it exposes how manufactured the whole system is. One of our sources made a brilliant point. If two senators from the absolute polar opposite ends of the spectrum can agree on something this fundamental, then all the constant chaos starts to look manufactured.
It starts to look like a strategy. A show.
Exactly. For the average voter looking in, if these two guys can agree, why are we fighting about everything else all the time? It suggests the endless partisan war is designed to keep voters from seeing any clarity at all.
So unity is toxic to the business model.
That's the perfect way to put it. Bipartisanship is treated like contamination because it proves that some issues are moral, not ideological. And that strips the party's narrative of its power. If a voter realizes they don't need a party's permission to know terror is evil, the control mechanism is gone.
So leadership has to scramble to repolarize. They have to rebuild the wall.
Immediately. They have to shove everyone back into their ideological boxes, even if it means sacrificing a clear moral stand. Preserving the divide is more important than making the statement.
That's an existential threat to them. If people start thinking for themselves outside the partisan lines, the political managers lose their entire purpose.
It is absolutely existential for them.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the calculation of silence. We know leadership went quiet. They didn't even try to reframe it. That silence was the loudest part of the whole affair.
So why? Why the deafening silence?
It was a cold, hard calculation, a strategic decision driven by pure fear of the political cost. They had three horrible options.
Affirm him, condemn him, or go silent.
Right. And they chose silence. They calculated that affirming Fetterman would mean war with their far-left activist base. They calculated that condemning him would make them look morally bankrupt to every moderate in the country.
So silence was the only path that didn't lead to immediate disaster.
It was a temporary truce with reality. They were terrified of angering, and I'm quoting a source here, activist blocs that treat moral certainty as aggression.
Wait, moral certainty as aggression. How does that even work? How do you twist logic that far?
It's an academic framework. The argument is that any final, absolute judgment like calling something evil, period, shuts down what they see as a necessary conversation about root causes and systemic issues.
So a blunt moral statement gets in the way of their political project.
For that part of the base, yes. The priority is to analyze the world through a lens of grievance and complexity. Simplicity is the enemy because it removes the context they need to argue for fundamental change.
So leadership, by staying silent, was basically sending a coded message to that base saying, we hear you, we are prioritizing your complex worldview over simple moral judgment.
It was a transaction. They traded public moral clarity for internal coalition peace. But for the public watching, that silence is anything but neutral. It's a confession.
It tells you that fear of your own base is more powerful than the need to align with the rest of the country.
It reveals a moral fault line in real time. The longer they stayed silent, the more that silence became their official policy. And swing voters see that. They see politicians weighing the cost of saying something that is obviously true. And that's devastating.
It tells them that condemning terror is no longer a shared value. It's now a political risk that has to be managed.
And that's the core of it. The silence wasn't because they didn't know what to say. It was because they knew exactly what it would cost them to say it. And they decided the cost was too high.
So the party's main job right now is just managing its own internal contradictions. And Fetterman just forced one of those contradictions out into the open for everyone to see.
He forced a choice. And they chose fear.
Okay, let's talk about the timing of all this, because not an accident. Our sources are very clear. The terror attack as the catalyst. This wasn't some academic debate. This was a reaction to a recent terror attack. Why was that timing so bad for them?
Because it completely blew up their usual playbook of delay and obfuscation. In the face of a raw, immediate tragedy, the public doesn't want a political science lecture. They want a moral response.
All the usual tactics. We need to wait for more information. It's a complex situation. They just sound hollow.
They sound insulting.
Yeah.
The attack created a moral emergency. The public demanded a binary answer. Do you condemn this, yes or no? There was no room to maneuver.
So the attack didn't just expose a security threat. It exposed a moral one inside our own political system. Fetterman answered instantly. The party hesitated.
And in that hesitation, the public saw everything. His clarity made their caution look like weakness. It made it look like calculation. It made it look cowardly.
And of course, this immediately hits the biggest fault line of all, the deep democratic fracture over Israel. Fetterman's statement, with its absolute language, made his pro-Israel stance radioactive inside his own party.
Israel is the ultimate third rail for Democrats. The internal conflict is just massive. You have this huge, powerful donor base that is traditionally strongly pro-Israel. And at the same time, you have this incredibly vocal, motivated activist base on the ground that is fiercely critical of Israeli policy, framing it in the language of social justice and oppression.
So leadership strategy is just, don't move, stand perfectly still, and hope nobody notices.
They try to stand perfectly still. But Fetterman just set off an earthquake. By refusing to add any qualifiers, he blew up that delicate truce.
He wouldn't blur the line between defending civilians and appeasing activists.
No. His clarity forced the party to confront a split they have been desperately trying to manage behind closed doors for years. Suddenly, the internal squirming was visible to everyone because he drew a moral line in the sand and forced everyone to decide which side they were on.
So if donors demand clarity and the activists demand complexity, Fetterman gave the donors exactly what they wanted.
And in doing so, he confirmed the activists' worst fears about what they see as unnuanced, militaristic thinking. He made the quiet part loud.
Which, and this is the strategic genius of it, whether it was intentional or not, it folds right back into the Trump administration backdrop. Fetterman's style in that moment was basically Trump's style.
That's why it hit so hard. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. The entire political environment right now, especially on national security, is dominated by blunt, clear language.
Naming threats, talking about borders, no academic hedging. Fetterman adopted that exact rhetorical posture.
And when a Democrat does that, it doesn't just challenge his own party's messaging. It validates the entire framework of the opposition. It tells millions of voters that, yes, clarity is possible, clarity is effective, and ambiguity is a choice.
So the Democrats can't just write it off as right-wing framing anymore, not when one of their own is using it. And voters see that contrast. They see Trump's bluntness, and then they see the Democratic Party's hesitation on something as basic as terror.
It's an absolutely devastating political comparison. You've got one side speaking with what voters perceive as strength and clarity about threats, and you've got the other side having an internal debate about the political risks of using the word evil. When people feel scared, who do you think they're going to listen to?
It's a perfect trap. Fetterman set a perfect trap. If they criticize him, they look weak on terror. If they support him, they validate their opponent's entire rhetorical strategy.
It's a lose-lose.
Yeah.
Dictated by one man saying something everyone already believes. Which brings us back to that incredible observation from the source material. The most dangerous thing in politics right now isn't extremism, it's agreement.
That feels so backward. Explain that. Why is common ground the biggest threat?
Because the entire system runs on controlled conflict. When John Fetterman and Ted Cruz arrive at the same moral conclusion, it does more than just show a shared value. It exposes how much the partisan divide is manufactured for show.
It holds up a mirror to Washington, and the reflection is not pretty. It tells voters this is a managed conflict, not a real one.
Right. Agreement breaks their control. Unity is treated like a virus, like contamination, because it suggests that you don't need the party's ideological lens to understand the world. And when that happens, leadership has to scramble to repolarize everything. They have to violently push everyone back into their corners.
Because if they don't, voters might realize that some things aren't left or right, they're just right or wrong.
And that realization is the single biggest threat to the power of the modern political party.
Okay, let's flip this around now and look at the people who actually matter in all this. The voters. Because the irony is, Fetterman's statement was only controversial inside the D.C. bubble. Outside of it, he didn't persuade voters, he echoed them.
That's the whole story right there. That's the disconnect. For most Americans, this wasn't news. They already believe terror is evil. They already believe moral clarity is a good thing. And more than anything, they are just exhausted by the constant need to qualify obvious truths.
That word exhausted, that hits hard. When a politician has to dance around an obvious truth, the voter doesn't hear nuance. They hear fear or dishonesty.
Or both. And that's why the moment went viral. It wasn't the message, it was the messenger. People looked at Fetterman and they felt, finally somebody just said it without apologizing for it.
Finally, somebody who sounds like a real person.
Exactly. The shock was entirely contained within the political class reacting to its own broken rules.
Yeah.
The public just saw a guy representing reality. And it confirmed what they already suspected, that politicians have been holding this simple truth hostage for their own political reasons.
So if the voters are all on board with this, why is the party establishment still so terrified? It feels like they're fighting a battle that their own voters don't want them to fight.
Which brings us to the warning shot. Fetterman's move has to be seen as a sign of the electoral consequences to come. And the analysis is brutal. If the party continues to prioritize activist feelings over clear moral statements, the damage will be immense.
What's the path of that damage? How does it play out?
It's a three-stage collapse. First, trust erodes. Voters see you're not being straight with them. Second, credibility vanishes. They stop believing you can actually lead on tough issues like national security if you can't even define the threat. And third,
They just stop listening.
they stop listening altogether. You become irrelevant because you're no longer speaking a language they understand or respect.
It's an impossible bind. You can't claim you'll keep the country safe while sounding unsure about threats. You can't ask for moral authority while refusing to use moral language.
And they are trapped. They're getting crushed on the safety narrative by a much blunter opposition, but they are too paralyzed by their own activist wing to fight back with the simple, clear language that voters are desperate to hear.
So they're choosing to manage the fear inside their coalition instead of addressing the fear of the actual electorate.
And the opposition reaps all the benefits. They don't even have to do anything. The Democrats' hesitation, their silence, that becomes the most effective campaign ad against them. Fetterman showed them the fork in the road. One way is back to clarity. The other is deeper into a self-imposed silence that leads to political oblivion.
Which brings it all together. This isn't about left versus right. This is the reckoning of convenience versus truth.
That's the real battle Fetterman forced. And it leaves us with a really uncomfortable question, one aimed right at the heart of the Democratic Party. What does it say about your organization when calling terror evil is a risky political move?
What does it say when agreeing with the wrong person on a basic moral truth is seen as betrayal?
And what does it say when moral clarity has to be put through a political cost-benefit analysis before it can be spoken out loud?
It says the political machine has become completely disconnected from the moral common sense of the people it's supposed to represent. Fetterman didn't start a revolution. He just said something obvious, and the panic that followed revealed everything.
The discomfort, the silence. It all told us that the deepest fault lines in our politics right now are not ideological. They're moral. They are about a system that has decided it's no longer politically convenient to say what is obviously true.
So what does this all mean? The moment one person inside the system spoke plainly, the entire structure of controlled messaging shook. Fetterman simply asked Washington to represent reality.
And the reaction proved how far from reality it's drifted. This deep dive shows that the real divides in politics now are moral and linguistic. They are about the integrity of the words our leaders use.
The party that can't stomach the word evil risks losing the ear of the nation.
They can't lead on what they refuse to name. The choice for you, for voters, isn't just about who is in power anymore. It's about who speaks plainly, who hides behind jargon, and who still has the courage to say the obvious when it's no longer safe.
That's the reality we're facing. But I want to know what you think. Is moral clarity a lost cause in modern politics? Or is Fetterman's move the start of a comeback for common sense? Let us know your opinion in the comments below. We read every single one. I'm Alex.
And I'm Sophia. Thanks for listening to News Focus.